Um, Welcome back, everybody. So we're going to begin into Unit 3, and we're actually going to combine uh, five learning targets into one here, um, just because a lot of this stuff is, at least alluded to or even completely discussed in previous units. So there's really no need to tease out all five of these learning targets into separate videos this time. Okay, but we're going to focus in on populations, both in natural systems, ecosystems, but also we'll look closely at the human population later on in the unit. The enduring understanding, of course, is that populations change over time in reaction to a variety of factors. Okay, so topic three, reading, very important. So if you guys do what you're supposed to, right? You will then follow up this lecture by going to section 7.3 in your textbook, pages 189 through 196, and you'll find lots of information to accompany what we're doing right now. Okay, so the five topics we will cover are specialist and generalist species, so we'll do a very fast review of that. We're going to discuss case-selected and R-selected species and what those mean. And then we'll compare those two selected species to what we call a survivorship curve. Then we'll talk about the term carrying capacity and what that means. And then we'll talk about how carrying capacity ties in with population growth and resource availability. All right. So again, we've talked about generalist species and specialist species this entire school year. It came up in Unit 1. Just sort of organically, and likewise in Unit 2. So just a reminder of what the terms mean. A specialist species is one that lives in various specialized areas, right? So they might be highly adapted to a very specific habitat, okay? Whereas the generalist species has the types of adaptations that allow it to live in lots of different habitats. Okay, and we already talked about the fact that our specialist species are definitely more prone to becoming endangered or extinct over time. All right, so our new topic though, case-selected and R-selected species. So a case-selected species would be a type of species that has a low number of offspring, right? And therefore compensate for those low numbers of offspring by having high parental care. So they're not going to have a lot of children at one time. And so what they do is they care for those children to help them survive to adulthood. Okay, so case-selected species tend to have longer lifespans, slower development. So a juvenile won't reach maturity for several years, sometimes even tens of years. Right? They often have larger body size. They tend to reproduce later in life, and as a result, have a lower reproductive rate. Now, another thing is that because of the longer lifespans, etc., they often tend to have habitats in which there's a higher competition for resources. So some examples would be like elephants, right? Often just one elephant child at a time, right? They're often in gestation for long periods of time, but elephant mothers, and in fact their herds, tend to care for those young all the way until adulthood. Whales are another example, and then humans are a case-selected species as well. All right, now contrast that with our R-selected species. So R-selected species have, whoops, sorry, excuse me, that is not at all, I did not update my slide very well. They have a high offspring, low parental care. I am sorry about that. So R-selected is essentially the opposite of the case-selected. High number of offspring, low parental care, right? So they tend to have smaller body sizes, early maturity, shorter lifespans, large broods, like I just said, and little or no parental care. So the idea there being that they have so many offspring that at least some of them will survive to adulthood or survive to reproduce. Case-selected species have a low number of offspring and help ensure that those smaller numbers, through parental care, reach maturity, right? Our selected species basically just have a whole bunch of offspring at once, and just through sheer probability, some of those will survive to maturity. Okay, um, and they tend to have lower competition for resources. So some examples would be like dandelions. So seeds spread out to the wind. Other examples would be lots of our insect species. Um, And then, like sea turtles, for example, they'll lay their eggs in the sand. Quite a few of them get fertilized all at once, but then as soon as they hatch, it's a mad dash to the sea before they get scooped up by shorebirds, and then they're off to fend for themselves, right? So there's a high mortality rate, but also because there's so many of them, a relatively high probability that at least some will survive to maturity. All right. So, topic 3.3 is survivorship curves, and this is a direct extension of R and K selected species. So, there's basically three types of survivorship curves. All right. And another thing that we want to make sure we're understanding too is that the R selected to K selected species is really more of a spectrum. Some species fit into kind of in between, and sometimes it really just depends on the occasion and the circumstance. Some species will shift from more of an R selected to a K selected, depending, right? So let's think of that as a spectrum, and likewise, these survivorship curves uh, are representative of K versus R, but we have to understand that most species are going to fall somewhere in between what you're seeing here. All right. So notice over here on the type 1 survivorship curve, right? We have a human. Humans are case-selected species, right? So if we look at the survivorship, so let's say we start with 1,000 offspring, right? Notice that there is a high survival rate among that type 1 survivorship curve. And that survival rate, of course, decreases the older we get, okay? And that is because people generally have relatively few offspring, but they care for those to help assure that a high percentage of those offspring survive to maturity. Now, we've taken a fully R selected species to start with 1,000 offspring, but relatively few of them actually survive to adulthood, right? But then generally, once they get past a certain age, that survivorship curve increases, right? As our type 3. So type 3 would be our fully R selected. Type 1 would be our more fully K selected. And then type 2 just sort of fit in between those two. Okay. Now again, this is a spectrum, and in fact, some species even fit in between, like a 2 and a 3, or in between a 1 and a 2. So for example, uh, herring gulls hit both a type 2 and a type 3. They start off as sort of a type 3 curve at the beginning, early in adulthood, but then the rest of their life they hit more of a type 2 type survivorship. Okay? Now, the important thing to remember is there are very successful species that fit all types, anywhere on the spectrum of K to R, right? All types of survivorship curves. There's lots of species that are highly successful in all three types. So it's not necessarily that one is better than the others, although, right, K-selected species, right, are more vulnerable to things like overexploitation, and they're often more adversely impacted by invasive species. And that's really simply a matter of reproductive rate. So whales, for example, they're well adapted to the ocean, and their habitat is very large. They have an immense food supply, but because they reproduce so slowly, overexploitation, overhunting in the early 20th century, especially, really killed their numbers, and it takes them a long time to recuperate because they reproduce slowly, right? Likewise, because many invasive species are selected, it gives them a little bit of a reproductive advantage when they're introduced to a system because they can reproduce very quickly. And if there's no predators, for example, in that area, their populations can boom really fast, and so they can outcompete just simply through sheer numbers. All right. Now, moving forward, when an organism, and it really doesn't matter what type of organism it is, Um, if you put an organism into ideal conditions, so as much space and everything it needs, right, um, it will undergo a type of population growth that we call exponential, right? So, it's going to double every so much time. So, like the bacteria example right here, notice that every 30 seconds, right? 30 minutes, the bacteria doubles. So we go from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, right? That doubling manifests itself as what we call this J-shape curve, which is representative of what we call exponential growth. Now, when a population is at its maximum rate of growth, right, we call that the biotic potential. So that's how fast a population would grow. Um, if there was no environmental resistance, no constraints, so plenty of food, plenty of water, all the space, no competition, etc. That's what would have happened. All right. Um, so it's that maximum rate of growth, and that produces a J-shaped curve, and lots of populations will show this, um, especially when they're introduced to a new environment. Okay. Now, there are, of course, limiting factors. Populations cannot just grow forever. Eventually, the environment, there's limitations in food, limitations in space, right? Uh, the environment kicks in to limit the size of that population. So we have to account for the ecological tolerance of that organism, right? Which is what we talked about in an earlier unit, right? So they're only going to survive really well within a certain range, right? We also have to account for resource availability, how much food, how much water is there. Disease becomes more and more of an issue the more dense a population gets. Okay, and then of course just space. So uh, we get intrinsic our intrinsic rate of growth before environmental resistance kicks in. As soon as there's some sort of environmental resistance, though, we start putting limitations on how fast that population can grow, and likewise how big that population can get. All right. And so what we end up seeing is if we introduce a species to a new environment, we'll see initially it goes through that exponential growth, but then eventually we hit a stage where environmental resistance kicks in and that rate of growth begins to decrease over time and often will level off. Okay, so growth cannot just continue forever. Eventually, the environment kicks in to put some limitations on it. Okay, so some factors that affect our population size, and this is going to be some important vocabulary for us. Number one are what we call density dependent factors, and these are factors that impact our population size that change or increase based on how dense the population is. All right. So predation, for example, and disease and competition, they all become more and more pronounced um, the bigger a population gets in a certain area. So if there's all kinds of food available and very few organisms to consume that food, competition is very low. But if we introduce more individuals without growing the food source, competition for that food source becomes larger. Disease can spread much more rapidly in a dense population than it can otherwise. Okay, um, so those are what we call density dependent factors. Okay, there's also density independent factors that come in sort of randomly occasionally to affect our population size that aren't really dependent on the size or density of a population. So that would be things like a severe weather event, right? Or a volcanic eruption. Those things, of course, can impact a population size, but they're not really dependent on how big or dense a population is. All right. Um, Now, the next term I want to introduce, and this is topic 3.4, which is carrying capacity. All right. So we have our exponential phase. So before environmental resistance kicks in, all right, environmental resistance kicks in, and we get this what we call logistic phase of growth. So it's sort of like the opposite of exponential growth. All right. And then eventually, right, a healthy population growth curve will level out at what is called the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity means simply the maximum sustainable population. So populations can exceed their carrying capacity, but that's going to be followed by an eventual population decrease over time. So that carrying capacity is the maximum population that an environment can maintain or sustain over time. Okay. Um, so in reality, right, we're going to sort of hover around that point. So we have our carrying capacity here, right? And notice that this population sort of hovers up and down. So the population increases a little bit, so then maybe food supply dwindles a little bit, which causes the population to go down, which allows food supply to maybe grow again, and so on. So we sort of hover around this imaginary point that we call the carrying capacity. Okay, and this would be sort of an ideal population curve. This is what we want populations to do. We reach that dynamic equilibrium in their population size. Hovers around it, but never strays too far from it. Now, sometimes in ecosystems, right, we can have a disruption. So maybe we run into a situation where a group of primary consumers, herbivores, right, the predator is wiped out. Maybe a virus comes in and wipes out a top predator. All right. Well, without that predator present, there's nothing to keep the herbivore population down initially, and so the population might overshoot its carrying capacity, right? Because we're lacking that predator to help maintain that population. And what will happen then is they will overeat, right? And so the population will become so large that competition for resources and diminished food supply causes a severe population crash, right? And this happens in nature. It's not super unusual, all right? Um, but when a population overshoots its carrying capacity, it's going to eventually be followed by a major population crash. Okay, and removal of like a top predator, for example, can cause that to happen. But and nature is full of examples like this. All right. Um, Now, we've been introduced some math in class a little bit about human population, more specifically immigration, immigration, crude birth rate, crude death rate, etc. All right, and then we talked about how we can project future populations over time. Okay, so human population, by and large, until present, has been undergoing this exponential growth. We hit some bumps in the road back with the medieval ages with bubonic plagues and stuff like that. But particularly since the Industrial Revolution, we've had this J-shaped curve. So we're at our biotic potential, right? Now, eventually we're going to hit some resistance. Human population cannot just grow forever. Okay, so experts in the field have made several predictions about where our population might level off. Now, some think it's going to level off very, very soon, around 7.7 billion, which is right about where we are right now. It's not very likely, right? The high end of that takes us all the way up to 10.6 billion by 2050, or 2050. But I think most likely we're going to land somewhere around 9.2 billion by 2050, and really, really start to level off after that. Uh, taking us taking us back to the idea of ecological footprints, though, right? We talked about how we've already essentially overshot our carrying capacity in terms of Earth's ability to maintain our population, right? So we've overshot it, and we're sort of maintaining it through the use of things like fossil fuels and water that's deep underground, things that are not renewable. Okay. Now, it might just be that we find other ways to make up those gaps through technology. I'm not trying to spell doomsday here, but it is worth noting that based on current rates of resource replenishment, humans have overshot that carrying capacity. All right. Um, and so, one of the things that's a big concern for us is we would really like to avoid something like this because that is actually a very scary scenario, right? That looks like mass disease, starvation, warfare. Um, that looks pretty scary to me. All right, and yes, of course, we're experiencing a pandemic right now, but it is not anything that would cause a population crash for us. It's just not that deadly of a virus. It is very deadly. We need to take it seriously and be careful. But it's not so deadly that it's going to cause a major population crash. All right. Ideally, what we'd like to see is, yeah, human population is going to level off or decrease in the future. At some point, it just has to happen, right? That's a fact. Of course, we'd love to see it kind of level off somewhere at our carrying capacity where we have a sizable population that's able to live and thrive indefinitely without overusing resources. All right. So this is not to scare you. This is just to bring up a really important point that with current technology, we have overshot our carrying capacity. Right. When things like fossil fuels and fossil water run out, we could be in a lot of trouble without some sort of way to fill that gap with some other technology. All right. That is it for today. And I'll see you guys next time.